Boa noite, camaradas, and welcome to this latest episode of Jacobin's Stay-at-Home series. For those of you who have not been around these parts before, the Stay-at-Home series is on most nights on Jacobin's YouTube channel around 6 p.m. Eastern. The next episode is with Leo Panic, a real giant of the international left, on the question of Ralph Miliband and his legacy in politics. That is on Monday night at 6 p.m. Eastern, and I encourage you all to tune in. To get this going tonight, we would ask you to like the video, to subscribe to Jacobin's YouTube channel, and to leave comments, because we're going to have a Q&A session after the talk. So this is the latest in the European takeovers of the Stay-at-Home series, and the 25th of April today is a portentous day for the European left. Not only is it the Festa della Liberazione in Italy, the day to celebrate the partisan victory over fascism in Italy, but in Portugal, where we'll be focusing tonight, it's the anniversary of the 1974 Carnation Revolution, when in the first instance, a military coup rose up against the Estado Novo regime. For a lot of the international left, the Carnation Revolution is full of romantic imagery. The troops with the carnations in their rifles, the story of Grandola Villa Morena playing on Renascença radio to trigger the coup against the dictatorship. But it wasn't only the military coup, it was the beginning of a profound revolutionary wave, probably the most profound revolutionary wave of Europe in the post-war period. And tonight, to discuss the Carnation Revolution, we are joined by Catarina Principe. Catarina is a Jacobin contributing editor. She is a Portuguese activist and writer who's been involved in the Portuguese left for a long time. She's also the co-author of Europe in Revolt, along with Bhaskar Sunkara. And she is a PhD student in political economy. But for tonight, Catarina Principe is going to be our guide through Portugal's great revolutionary wave, the Carnation Revolution, the year of 1974. And I will hand you over to her
now. Hi, good evening. It's a little bit late in Portugal. It's 11 p.m. But I'll do my best to hopefully keep you interested in what I have to say. And I do believe that one of the reasons why we're talking about the Portuguese Revolution of 74-75, it's because this was the last revolution in the so-called Western world. So tonight I'm here to sort of, as Ronan said, guide you through what happened, but also as the question of this stay-at-home was, so the Portuguese Revolution brought us democracy, but why not socialism? I hope I managed to answer this a little bit at least. And so to start, I think it is important to sort of frame what was Portugal before 74. And so before the 25th of April of 74, Portugal was immersed in 48 years dictatorship. And this was the longest lasting dictatorship in Europe. And Portugal was also the least industrial developed country in Western Europe, with very high levels of poverty and illiteracy. In the years of 33 and 74, almost 2 million people left the country, and the Portuguese economy was strongly dependent on the money that those migrant workers in Germany and France and also in the US were sending home. Actually, in the 1970s, these transfers amounted to around 8% of the GDP. But the Portuguese economy was also deeply dependent on the colonies of Angola, of Mozambique, of Guinea-Bissau. This was called an import-export economy, meaning that the government and the big capitalist groups would import raw materials from the colonies and export them back into Portugal to transform them into manufactured products to then be sold back both in the country and in the colonies. So due to this deep economical dependency on the colonies, the fascist regime started a very cruel war against the independence movements in the colonies. Just to give you a sense, from the total of the Portuguese population, which amounted to around 9 million people, over 1 million were soldiers and thousands were stationed at the colonies. And this war lasted 13 years and was fought on several fronts. In 1974, the year of the beginning of the revolution, the regime, the fascist regime, was running out of solutions. There was the tiredness of the war, the strong economical crisis coming from the end of European prosperity, and also the war expenses, which were more than the half of the state budget. This all led to growing political and social agitation. There were around 100,000 strikers in the industry and service sectors between October 73 and April 74. Dozens of arrested students and even universities stopped. The political police acted violently against the opposition, closed cultural cooperatives and clinics. However, this social and political unrest was not capable to tear down the regime. The situation will only explode, or would only explode, once the military coup of the 25th of April 1974 opened the political space for it. So what happened actually on the 25th of April? So on the night from the 24th to the 25th, the MFA, so the Armed Forces Movement, which was a progressive clandestine organization inside the military that was composed mainly by intermediate soldiers, left several barracks around the country, occupied the Catholic radio, as Ronan said, the Radio Renascença, and played two songs. The first one was E Depois do Adeus, from Paulo Carvalho, and the second one, Grândola Vila Morena, from Zeca Afonso, which served as sort of a countersign that things were going as planned. And because of this, Grândola became the anthem of the revolution, also for its meaning and its lyrics, which we will show this in the end of this talk. And the song gave the signal for several armed groups of the MFA to leave the caserns and take the streets of Lisbon after taking over the public television and announcing the military coup. And this coup was the catalyst for the revolutionary uprising. But in the beginning, it didn't intend to be one. It didn't intend to be a catalyst. The coup actually comes from the tiredness of the colonial wars. The war could only last as long as it did because Portugal lived under a dictatorship. So after 13 years, and because the opposition to the war had difficulties to demonstrate itself publicly and politically, it started to demonstrate itself inside the armed forces, especially at the level of the intermediate soldiers, as almost all the higher officers stood on the side of the regime. In this sense, the main drive of this military coup of the 25th of April is the understanding that only democracy could end the war. And there are three main forces or factors, I believe, on why this military coup became a revolutionary process. First is the fact that the coup was organized by intermediate officers with the broad support of the rank and file, meaning that the soldiers that were actually on the field and coordinated the military actions were the ones that took up this revolt. And this broke the hierarchical chain of command of the armed forces, paralyzing the normal functioning of the armed wing of the state, and it breaks an important power, the repressive part of the state power. Secondly, an important part of the armed forces transforms itself later into a political movement with progressive political demands, and an important part of it becomes even a revolutionary and militant movement. Thirdly, the weakness of state power that existed already from before the revolution allows for the explosion of the social and political tensions that have accumulated during the last years of the regime. On the 25th of April, the MFA announced that the people should remain at home because they feared armed confrontations on the street. But the Portuguese population clearly disobeyed the military orders to stay at home because the thirst for freedom overcame all fears. And so people took the streets to the thousands and supported the military coup when they occupied the general headquarters of the political police in Lisbon to force the resignation of the leader of the regime, Marcelo Caetano, because Salazar died in 1970. The people brought red carnations and distributed them to the soldiers, who stuck them in their rifle barrels, making the flower the symbol of the revolution. I have a small one here tonight because this is the only one I had to show you. And so the MFA stood politically for an opening of the Portuguese economy to the Western European model. And not many soldiers could actually be called socialists. But the Portuguese revolutionary process was not just about this. It was about the forces that the MFA helped to unleash. And so, in this sense, the revolutionary process of 74 and 75 was one of the liveliest experiences in Portuguese history. In 19 months, there were 2 failed coups, 6 provisional governments, the process of independence of the colonies, several mass strike waves, demonstrations, occupations of thousands of houses, a profound agricultural reform, occupations of land, the creation of workers' cooperatives, workers' councils, trade unions, neighborhood commissions, self-managed factories, businesses, offices, newspapers, and radios. So the MFA started an amazing campaign of education, sending soldiers around the country to support the opening of popular education experiences. And this was called the Movement for Cultural Dynamization. The number of illiterate people in Portugal was at the time more than 25%. And this experience can almost symbolize the Portuguese Revolution. It meant the soldiers leaving the barracks and politics entering the barracks. And workers and soldiers went to the countryside to support peasants. Children taught adults how to read. Popular clinics and cultural centers flourished everywhere. People's tribunals were established. And also, old morals were put into question, and women took leading roles in many of the struggles. There was an explosion of all sorts of left-wing organizations, like different strands of Trotskyists, many Maoists, the ones who were supported by China, the ones that weren't, pacifists, and even those who stood for armed struggle. And the left flourished after almost 50 years of dictatorship in every corner of the country, in every school, in every household. Even the bus tickets had revolutionary slogans on them. For example, children could tell one about the many political parties on their left, their papers, their badges, their slogans, and furthermore, they could even explain why they supported a particular party. Workers discussed the situation in France, in England, in Chile, which was an important reference at the time, or in Brazil, as if they had been professors of politics all their lives. Neighborhood meetings were sometimes called the universities of the class. And so class consciousness developed extraordinarily fast, and people started to understand themselves as a class with demands and dreams, and actually learning that they had much more power than they ever knew. And this was the most profound transformation of the productive and social forces in Portugal ever. It was the experience of real democracy, where thousands of people were called to actually take part in decision-making processes everywhere. And the revolutionary left, and the revolution left a legacy that shaped in many ways the state and the political and social dynamics of today, but I will come to this in a moment. And this was a revolutionary moment for the democratization of the state, in which the popular initiative was much stronger than the military one. And this is an important thing. Firstly, it was the people who teared apart the repressive apparatus of the state. So it was the people who assaulted the headquarters of the political police, who forced the liberation of political prisoners, who destroyed the headquarters of the censorship, who sent away from the factory or from the school or from the company those who were responsible for acts of repression during fascism. Secondly, it was this popular movement which conquered the public freedoms on the street, the freedom of association, of opinion, of reunion, much before they were even made legal by the provisional governments. The fundamental freedoms in this sense were not given, but they were conquered. Thirdly, it was a revolutionary movement for social justice, which was capable for some years to alter the historical relation between labor and capital. It conquered the right to strike and to form trade unions, the minimum wage, the reduction of labor time, paid holidays, sickness and food subsidies. Social democracy, in this sense, was a direct result from the people's struggle. Fourthly, it was a revolutionary movement which opened the way to the deepest democratization of access to public life through the democratization of access to education, the multiplication of directly elected structures in public institutions, schools, universities, or trade unions. It was a revolutionary movement which tried to introduce profound changes in the economic and social structure of the country, nationalizing financial capital and the big economic groups, occupying and expropriating the land from the big landowners, experiencing workers' control in several workplaces, occupying houses, and collectively building social housing. It was a revolutionary movement which created locally and very spontaneously new forms of power, representation, and management in companies and neighborhoods. These workers and dwellers' commissions would later have constitutional and legislative consecration, and some even still exist today. This was a revolutionary movement which set the basis for a new generation of public, universal and free of charge public services, education, health, and social security. It was a time which also reshaped the daily life and the private sphere, questioning old morals, fighting for sexual freedom, divorce, or abortion. It was also the time of new TV, new radio, new films and theater, big murals in the cities. It was also the time of the sort of explosion of creativity when anything seemed possible and people actually experienced new ways of coming together and relating to one another. And this might be possible, that there might be a possibility of discussion here, but I think that in many ways Portugal was at the time the freest country in the world. So, but why did this experience not bring socialism? This is actually the question of this stay at home. Because as we know, Portugal is not a socialist country today. And so to explain this, it's important to explain the beginning of the end. And the beginning of the end of the revolutionary process happens in the 25th of November of 1975, when the moderate and right-wing sections of the armed forces finally regained control over the radical and revolutionary parts of the soldiers, of the armed forces. The 25th of November brings the soldiers back into the barracks and takes them out of the streets, out of the occupied lands, out of the movement for cultural dynamization. There are several reasons which led to this moment, as the dependency on the military by important sectors of the revolutionary left, the dependency of class struggle towards a military organization, a certain, let's say, skepticism toward political parties, many of them which have just been funded during the years of the revolution and having therefore a very small social basis of support. It is also important to state, in my opinion, at this point, the sort of contradictory role played by the Portuguese Communist Party, which was the only party that existed in clandestinity during the dictatorship and that had the strongest implementation around the country. It is important to understand that if on the one hand, many of their rank and file members were radical, the party leadership had a sort of stagist approach, meaning that they believed that the left needed to make agreements and compromises with the Portuguese bourgeoisie in order to guarantee industrial and productive development, and then only later could the workers take control of the means of production. And on the 25th of November, the party leadership decided against supporting the rebelling soldiers that occupied the barracks in the outskirts of Lisbon. And their decision, in a decisive moment like this, with the central influence that they had on the trade unions, for example, allowed for the beginning of the end of the revolutionary process. But it is also important to understand this contradictory position. Why did they have this contradictory position? And I believe there are central geopolitical reasons for it, since the Soviet Union had absolutely no interest in Portugal. In the division of the world at the time, we were far too small and far too west. And that played a big role, and the CP had actually direct orders not to seize power. But besides that, there's a whole array of left-wing organizations that are important to talk about as well. And the newly formed revolutionary parties had a particularity that I think is important for some learnings that we might take of this experience, because they actually dismissed reformism as just another mask of capitalism. However, they underestimated the ability of reformist ideas to absorb a significant part of the working class. Militants of the revolutionary left had not been schooled on how to deal with reformism on day-to-day issues in the workplaces, in the unions, and even through the ballot box. And so the movement was young and it was unexperienced. And just to share with you an idea, and following Gramsci, it is important to remember that the working class cannot be prepared mechanically for the struggle like an army. Its involvement depends upon consciousness, which in turn grows in relation to practical experiences of struggle. In reality, if there is such a thing as a typical pattern of consciousness, that pattern is uneven and contradictory, because conflict is experienced also as uneven, discontinuous, and partial, and its organizational expressions normally reflect these characteristics, especially in the moment where revolutionary organizations were small and very unrooted. Therefore, reformist organizations were able to capture some of these contradictory patterns of consciousness and struggle, as did the Socialist Party, which was funded with money from the German SPD and the CIA, just as a parenthesis, in order to build a political bloc in favor of parliamentary bourgeois democracy and the integration of Portugal into Western capitalism. And so the radical rhetoric of the newly formed Socialist Party attracted many people who were tired and wanted to return to normality. And this happened especially after the so-called hot summer of '75, where extreme right-wing groupings around the country bombed left-wing organizations' headquarters and killed people in order to destabilize the revolutionary efforts and try to escalate the revolutionary process into eventually a civil war. However, that radical rhetoric of the Socialist Party disguised the political program of liberal social democracy and played a central role in actually calming down the revolutionary forces. And I also believe we cannot minimize the ideological role played by the Catholic Church, which was, since the beginning of fascism, the ideological arm of the dictatorship. And to be honest, and to share some of my thoughts, and not only my thoughts on this matter, I believe that the Portuguese Revolution suffered from a kind of to be or not to be syndrome. It had the strength to subvert the regime and target the foundations of capitalism. However, it was not capable to hold and deepen its victories, transforming it in a sustainable socialist power. And I think we can name some of these difficulties. The situation of dual power created by the thousands of popular elected structures in the factories, companies, neighborhoods, or in the big fields of the South was never able to constitute itself into a unified and articulated national political organization. And in their dispersion, many of this experience never assumed a clear political position, nor did they concretely deal with the question of how to take power. Moreover, during the Portuguese Revolution, the popular power structures were not armed. In contrast to, for example, the Russian or German experience, these structures were supported by an ally which was external to them, the MFA. And a part of it is a movement that gets more and more divided with time. This vulnerability became evident when the military forces were able to recapture the MFA soldiers into its chain of command. And in this sense, the mass movement lost its indirect armed arm, and it became an ununified and unexperienced political movement with strong demands, but no capacity to seize power. Additionally, the political field of the revolution was profoundly divided about the nature of power itself and how to build a path to seize it. And there was no clear left-wing force capable of sort of marginalizing all the others. Neither was there the capacity of finding a platform of common action. So there are not only bad things about this experience, so to say. And even if parliamentary democracy was a way to stop the revolutionary process, the revolution left a legacy that shaped the Portuguese democracy in a way that no other experience did. Democracy in Portugal exists not in spite of the revolution, but because there was a revolution. The struggle around the meaning of the revolution is still present and ongoing. A part of the Portuguese right wing, for example, puts forward the analysis that the fascist regime was opening itself and that it was on sort of a natural path towards democracy, and therefore the revolution wasn't a necessary process, but a dangerous time when Portugal lived under the threat of communism. But the popular meaning of the revolution is a different one. It is not seldom in Portugal to hear people say that what we need is a new revolution. And even if the understanding of what exactly a revolutionary moment is might not be the most conscious one, the memory of the Carnation Revolution is a positive one. It was the end of the dictatorship, it was the end of fear, and it was the end of silence. But it was also the experience that shook the rotten structure of authoritarianism and paved the way for a democratic society, a welfare state, and labor rights. And I believe that the experience of the Portuguese Revolution is an experience that we can take things to learn from today. It is not only about the question of reformism versus revolution. It is an experience that shaped the organization of left-wing organizations like the Left Bloc in Portugal, exactly in this coming together in the idea that fighting for reforms could not be left to organizations and political experiences that would only fight for reforms. So the idea that we can merge together the fight for reforms, having nonetheless even if in the background and open to adaptations in the political moment, the capacity of transforming ourselves into organizations these organizations transforming themselves into organizations that can adapt to the particular political moments that we're living. This is an important learning that comes from the Portuguese Revolution. And in a time of crisis, public health crisis with the virus, but also preparing for the crisis to come, I think the Portuguese Revolution left a mark that cannot be erased right now, in the sense that ideas and experiences like the public health sector in Portugal is perceived as a gain from a revolutionary moment and movement. And so it is very hard to tear apart the idea that this is the revolution was out for nothing, happened for no reason. So this idea of a present revolution that can change the concrete moment that we're living in, I think is still the reason why we should remember it, think about it, and celebrate it. And also, in a way, keep in mind that, in a way, if we did it once, we can do it again. Sorry, yes, there was a little misunderstanding here. So we're going to hear Grândola Vila Morena, the anthem of the revolution. I don't think the version that I have of it has subtitles, but basically the song centers on a city, Grândola. Grândola swarty town, so a town where people work in the fields and therefore they're tanned by the sun from their work, which is the land of fraternity. And the idea of the song is that it is sort of an idea that this town symbolizes the whole country as a land of fraternity where everyone can be free and come together. So this is the anthem of the revolution, and I think it would be nice to hear it tonight.
Grândola Vila Morena, terra da fraternidade, o povo é quem mais ordena, dentro de ti a cidade, dentro de ti a cidade, o povo é quem mais ordena, terra da fraternidade, Grândola Vila Morena.
Are there actually questions?
Grândola Vila.
Thank you very much, Catarina. And I would just remind all of those who are still tuned in and watching to go and subscribe to Jacobin's YouTube channel where we have you, and to like the video if you are watching at the moment. The Stay at Home series for Jacobin runs most nights at 6 p.m. Eastern time. The next episode will be Leo Panich on Monday, talking about the legacy of Ralph Miliband. But for now, we go to some questions that have come in on the YouTube comment thread. The first of them is from Jules, who's asking about the positioning of the Portuguese Revolution within the context of the Cold War. You touched on it a bit, Catarina, in terms of whether Portugal was too west to be permitted to go in a more socialist direction. How would you characterize the role of Cold War polarization in the Portuguese revolutionary process?
Expecting to happen, and so having a strong and implement. I should start again. Okay. No problem. So as I said, or I tried to say, is that Portugal, I mean, if we look at Europe in the 70s, the expectation for a socialist revolution wasn't there, it wasn't in the plans. So what happened in Portugal was a little bit unexpected in this sense. Although, and this is what I tried to say during my presentation, although the CP was the most implemented, the party with the strongest basis of support because it existed throughout the dictatorship in clandestinity, there was no clear support from the Soviet Union for a takeover, a seizing of power by the Communist Party, which would maybe have been possible if there was a clear support. And this is what I was trying to say, was that I believe that in the geopolitical dynamics of the time, Portugal was too west and too small in the division of the world. So I think that in 74, the Soviet Union had no interest in having this sort of strange experience happening in Western Europe that they would have to support if it went further. And so I think that's what happened. Nonetheless, it's important to state that Portugal was a semi-industrialized country, which would need a lot of international support from other countries and other left-wing forces at the time if it was to proceed with the revolutionary process. That didn't happen. And so in that sense, that was the decision of the Portuguese CP, influenced, of course, by the take of the Soviet Union of the geopolitical circumstances. I hope that answered the question.
Yes. So the next question is on a similar line. It's about the role of the Communist Party in terms of the decolonial process. So there were a number of questions about the role that the decolonial process had in influencing the Carnation Revolution, and a number of them were about Amilcar Cabral, who was killed in '73, and how all of that played into the revolution, which was to follow in Portugal, the degree to which there was a commonality of kind of struggle between the socialist movement, particularly the Communist Party in Portugal, and the communist-influenced anti-colonial movements in Portuguese colonies.
I think the most important thing to say about this is that it's not just because that the soldiers that led the military coup were intermediate soldiers, many of them that were fighting in the colonies. So if we're looking at their particular circumstances, what that meant was that they were in contact with the independence movements, the left-wing movements. They were sharing ideas and theories, but they were also the ones who were understanding that actually the war effort that was created in a way to fight for the motherland or the fatherland, whatever you want to take it, was actually not true, because what they were defending in the colonies, what they were fighting for, the soldiers, the Portuguese soldiers, was to defend the property and the wealth of Portuguese landowners and capitalists. They weren't standing in the war for the rights or the wealth of the people. And I think that understanding, that of course comes from the common experience of being in the same place as many of the militants in the colonies, of course influenced a lot of the soldiers. And if we also want to look at it in a more theoretical level, it's also not just because that a lot of the newly founded Portuguese left-wing revolutionary parties had influence from what we call third world communism, so a lot of different strands of Maoism, because these were the people that in many senses they were discussing with in the field when they were supposed to be fighting. I think it's clear that there is a relation, and it's not just because that this movement is led by the people who were in direct contact with the independence fighters in the colonies.
And Alexandra, who has raised a number of good points in the chat, is asking about the organizing in the years before the Carnation Revolution of the MFA. What kind of organizing that was done there? How was it carried off that you managed to have a large progressive democratic force within the Portuguese dictatorship's military, and how was that organizing done to the point where it was capable of carrying off a coup in favor of democracy against the Estado Novo regime?
I'm not sure. Thank you for the question. I don't know if I can answer it properly. I want to say that it wasn't a very big organization in terms of number. So there weren't many soldiers. Just the importance is that we have to look at this moment as a political moment of a tear off, a moment of tiredness of a regime as well, and tiredness of a war that seemed endless and useless. So it didn't take a big number of soldiers to actually organize this coup. There are some anecdotes about what actually happened on the 25th of April. So, for example, the tanks that left the barracks in Santarém, which is 1 hour today by car from the center of Lisbon, they took 8 hours to get there because they got lost and they ran out of gas. So the soldiers were highly unprepared. They were young, they were highly unprepared, and they were trying to organize a coup. They were trying to shift the political structure without having nor big numbers in terms of actual people that were actual soldiers that were organized, nor a clear idea about how this would be done. And this is what I think is a particular thing. It wasn't done by a highly organized, I mean, there had been some experience of organization. There was sort of a manifesto that was put out by a progressive part of the military a couple of years before, but this didn't gather a huge number of people. What was important was this feeling of tiredness and uselessness of this war and this regime, that this very unorganized and very small, in a way, coup attempt actually opened. So this is more about the forces it unleashed than actually about the highly organized, super structured capacity of doing this. And I think this is a very interesting particularity of the 25th of April.
Daryl Kavanagh in the comment thread on YouTube asks, what role, what influence did the Portuguese revolutionary process have in Spain, where obviously in the Iberian Peninsula there were these two long-standing dictatorships. What role did what was happening in Portugal have in Spain?
Once again, I don't know if I can answer that question that well. I mean, the progression of Spanish fascism and the transition to democracy is not the same as what happened in Portugal. So as I don't have a clear answer to that very interesting question, I will just say that what happened in Portugal, although there was no sort of domino effect and there was no multiplication of these experiences throughout Western Europe, I think this process created a sort of fear in other ruling classes that of the possibility of a sort of domino effect. So I do believe that the transition to democracy in Spain, although it happened in a very different way, maybe it might have happened faster because of the fear that the Portuguese experience could spread out to the peninsula, which would be then an experience much harder to control than just a very tiny country, the periphery of Europe.
So Punkadelic in the comments thread asks the question of how to look at this within the world order. So as he says, that the 1970s is known, I suppose, particularly in the United States and in the UK, as a moment when the world breaks rightwards. And you have these kind of developments in the midst of economic crisis of these new neoliberal models, which then rise through Reagan and Thatcher and begin to tear apart some of the post-war social democratic gains. can Portugal be seen then as a contrast to this, as a kind of left-wing break of the crisis of the 1970s as opposed to a right-wing one?
Yes and no, because I mean, yes, of course, but the Portuguese experience is also an effect of that crisis. So it is also because of the end, so the Portuguese economy throughout the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s had started to open itself to Western countries. It actually had trade agreements with some European countries, so it wasn't only an import-export based economy. It was mainly, but not only. So of course, the economic crisis of the 70s that we normally mark, or we normally say as, or we normally understand as a mark of the beginning of neoliberalism, also plays an effect on the conditions that created this revolution. So the end of European prosperity, so the end of the 30 golden years, also plays a role in that sense. But it would be hard in Portugal, since we had a 48-year-long fascist regime, although soft fascism, I mean, there's a lot of discussions about the particularities and the identity of Portuguese fascism. It was a 48-year-old experience of fascism, so it would be hard to go more right-wing. And in this sense, of course, Portugal is a sort of counter experience, but it's also an experience that happens in that context. So we cannot take out that context in order to understand what happened in Portugal.
I see a number of people in the comment thread asking about books and movies that they can follow up. Most of the questions are in English, so maybe perhaps best to direct people to. Do you have any recommendations? I know Jacobin last year ran an interview with Raquel Varela, right? She wrote a book.
It's republished. Jacobin republished that interview today. Actually, her book is translated into English. It's called, I think, The People's History of the Revolution in English. But I would highly advise people to watch in English, because there are only so many things people could watch in English. There is a very interesting documentary directed by two US Americans who were in Portugal for, I think, 1 year. So during that time, they went around the country, they filmed, and they thought about what was happening. They were reflecting on their own political positions, which is called Scenes of the Class Struggle in Portugal. I think the director is called Robert Kramer. It's a very interesting movie. It's in English, and I would highly advise, because it captures the feeling and also the very asymmetric experiences of the revolution throughout the country, because the interior north does not have the same type of experience as the south, for example. And so they capture these asymmetries of the revolutionary process. And I think it's a really, really amazing movie. Scenes of the Class Struggle in Portugal.
Another question which was coming up referenced your discussion of the Socialist Party in Portugal. Now, one of the interesting things about the legacy of the Portuguese Revolution is that even the right-wing parties are called the Social Democratic Party and all these things. There's such an embeddedness of that experience in Portugal. That means the kind of consensus of the term social democracy and all the rest spread very, very far. But you raised the question of the Socialist Party being established with the support of the SPD in Germany and the CIA. What then? How can that kind of party's development be seen maybe in contrast to some other parties in the social democratic scene in Europe, which were founded out of workers' movements in the early 20th century and so on? It seems what you're describing is a different kind of process in Portugal. So how would you characterize the Portuguese Socialist Party?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question because it also it's a question that is not fixed in that time. It also um, is an important debate about today and how to relate with these parties. For example, if we're talking about how to relate with the Labour Party on the left, it's a question that comes up particularly about the particular types of formation and the social and class dynamics that actually form this party. So I would say that on the one hand, it is a party that is formed out of a revolutionary moment, which is not true for most of the traditional, now liberalized social democratic parties in Europe. But because it was formed not out of a class organization and to be a sort of political representation of class struggle, it is also a party that is very volatile in terms of its class dynamic. If we look at the Socialist Party today, it is still true that its membership is much more left-wing than its leadership, which I think is mainly true for most of social democratic parties in Europe. But the relation to trade unions, groundwork organization, grassroots organizations, and so on is not the same. Because although they capture the moment in a very particular time, which was a revolutionary process, they didn't come out as an organized experience of struggle. So I don't know, I think they are in a way, there are very similar trajectories in these parties, but different moments of foundation.
Origins.
Sorry.
Different origins and characters of those parties. I mean, it follows onto another theme of the comments tonight, and thank you to everybody who has been commenting. I would encourage you, as I said earlier, to go subscribe to the Jacobin YouTube channel, to like this video, to spread the word about the Jacobin stay-at-home series to all of your comrades. But one other theme that's been coming up in the comments tonight is the question of the current Portuguese government. Because, of course, in many articles, particularly in the English language world, the aspects of the Portuguese government are extolled as examples by contrast to maybe more right-wing governments that have been elected in many countries. And there was a big moment in that, in the context of the aftermath of the Carnation Revolution, which is the decision of the Socialist Party to, in some respects, although it's not a coalition, to work with parties of the further left, the Communist Party, Bloc or Esquerda. That was a big historic moment. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that as the backdrop to that development, and why it was so historic that there was this kind of collaboration on the left in Portugal, whatever the limitations of it may be?
Yes, as you know, I am someone who is critical to that experience, but nonetheless, Portugal was under a memorandum like Greece from 2011 to 2015, where very harsh austerity measures were imposed. What happened in 2015, in October 2015, was that Portugal has a very, although it's not a dual party system, it is a dual party system. So between the Socialist Party, which are the Social Liberals, and the Social Democrats, which are the center right-wing party, they always are the ones that win majorities and are in government. What happened in 2015 was that for the first time, there was the possibility in Parliament, due to the numbers, of elected MPs, that the Socialist Party, together with left-wing parties, would form a government. That hadn't happened before in 40 years of democracy. And so after 4 years of harsh austerity and the mandates of the Troika, the IMF, the ECB, and the European Commission, there was a decision to form a minority government, so a government of the Socialist Party, supported in parliament by two left-wing forces, the Left Bloc, the Radical Left Party, which was formed in 1999, and the Communist Party. I don't think that this experience says much about any type of different nature of the Socialist Party. I think that what happened at that moment was that the Portuguese Socialist Party looked at what was happening with their counterparts, so their like sister organizations around Europe that were in a process of disappearance, basically. Like we actually have a name for this. We call it PASOKification. So what happened with the PASOK in the Socialist Party of Greece, because they had gone so much to the center that their political space wasn't clear anymore. And so they had two decisions. They would either go as a junior partner into a government led by the right wing, which had happened in other countries like Greece, and that meant the dismantling and the disappearance of the socialist parties, or they would try a sort of survival tactic, which would be to then make some small agreements on the left and try to sort of revitalize themselves. And I think that's just what happened. Because if we look at 2011, or if we look at the history of Portuguese democracy, it was the Socialist Party that approved most of social cuts and anti-labor laws. As it's actually something that happens throughout Europe with this traditional social democracy, social democratic parties, because they wouldn't have so much social contestation as a right-wing party approving the same measures. And they signed the memorandum with the Troika, just as the right wing did. So I think it was a question of revitalization. It wasn't a question of a different nature. And I think that's something that is important to understand. And there's also some interesting articles on Jacobin, for example, about this, of a different reading, if you want to take a look, which is more about revitalizing themselves than actually calling upon some sort of different nature coming from the memory of the revolution. I don't think it has anything to do with it.
Speaking then for our final question about the legacy of and the memory of the Carnation Revolution, I was thinking in the years before this government and the immediate aftermath of the economic crisis, you had movements like Catarina Troika. My Portuguese pronunciation is terrible, so people can enjoy it in the comment thread and give me much deserved abuse over it. But these were movements that seem to recall the Carnation Revolution, the singing of Grandola Villa Morena, the mass demonstrations, the slogans, the revolutionary slogans, the images of 1974 were present throughout those. To what degree does the Carnation Revolution still inspire the Portuguese, not only the left, but the Portuguese masses, working people in Portugal, at moments particularly of crisis? And what possibilities are there that kind of revolutionary flame from that era can be a real influence in future movements towards socialism in Portugal?
Okay, that's nice as a last question, because it allows me to be a little hopeful. There was some years ago, on the 40th anniversary of the Portuguese Revolution, so in 2014, there was an opinion poll that came out, and I remember it just now, about what were the understandings of the revolution by the people. And I think this the understandings that, as I remember them, that came out from this opinion poll point all in the correct direction. So what people understood as the most important gains of the revolution was the freedom of expression, was free, public, universal education and health. So that gives us two very concrete ideas or questions on where to focus political strategy. And it's also interesting because, as I recall it, I don't have it present with me because it was 6 years ago already, but as I recall it, it's also understandable because it was during the Euro crisis. I remember that in this opinion poll, the majority of people deemed the worst outcome of the Portuguese Revolution the adhesion to the European Union, which also might point us in a certain strategic direction today. But as Ronan was saying, and I think that is very interesting, what tends to happen in moments of big social mobilization, as it was the experience of Slisha Troika during the times of austerity, was that the symbols, the imagery, the ideas of the revolution are called upon to characterize what we're doing. And from the part of, it's very interesting, like during austerity, for example, Grandula Vila Morena, the song that we just heard, Grandula became a verb. It became grandular, because people went on parliament when austerity measures were being approved, or ministerial meetings, and they were interrupting the meetings by singing the song. So that became even a verb, grandular. And so the memory of the revolution, I hope, because it is a positive memory for the Portuguese people in general. So because it was, that's the idea that democracy didn't happen in spite of, but because of this revolution. A lot of things that we still have today, like a public health service, like public education, like social security, like the right to strike, like some still progressive labor laws, came from this experience. This is seen as something very positive. And so I think it is very intelligent, but it's also something that comes from sort of an instinct, because the memory of the revolution is so present and so positive that people pick up this references and imagery in order to build the idea of resistance to what is wrong. So something that is not okay has to be teared down by some sort of revolution. And I think that's that might be, or that can be, it's not might be, it can be a very powerful feeling from where to build upon for any sort of left-wing experience that aims at actually transforming deeply, profoundly the society that we have today.
Thank you very much, Catarina.
Thank you.
Long live the 25th of April.
Yes.
Fantastic action.
25 de Abril sempre, fascismo nunca mais.
And a great night to be able to talk about this legacy and the Carnation Revolution, an inspirational example for so many of us of the Portuguese people, Portuguese workers, rising up to overthrow a regime and to try to bring into being a new world in Portugal. I will remind people.
Can I just say something?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This was a very untypical 25th of April for a lot of us, because we couldn't go outside, we couldn't go to the streets, to the normal demonstrations and singing the Grandula together. So I would like to thank all of you that were here tonight, because this was a way to celebrate together with someone. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic, and we still have 100 people watching now. And I thank you all for your comments, for tuning in. It has been great. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but I hope we managed to span a good number of them. If you want to read more of Catarina's work, you can find it in Europe in Revolt, as we discussed earlier, which she co-edited with Bhaskar Sunkara, but also on the Jacobin website, where Catarina has written about the experience of the Portuguese government, a critical perspective, but on numerous other topics. So it's Catarina Principe, and you will find her work on the Jacobin website. A reminder that the Stay at Home series is on most nights, almost every night, on Jacobin at 6 p.m. Eastern. The next episode is on Monday with Leo Panich, talking about the legacy of Ralph Miliband and his relevance, the work of Ralph Miliband's relevance for struggles today. Thank you all for tuning in. I've been Ronan Burtonshaw, the editor of Tribune magazine. Both Tribune and Jacobin will soon have coronavirus issues out. Our one will be better, and I won't comment too much more on that in case I get a knocker on the head from Bhaskar. But you should pick both of them up, and also keep tuning in. Make sure to subscribe to the Jacobin YouTube channel, and we hope to see you all the next Stay at Home episode. So thank you all very much. Long live the 25th of April, and yeah, we'll just be thankful for the experience of the Carnation Revolution. See you all. Thank you.